Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, and the political editor of the Daily Mirror, John Stevens. Welcome to both of you. So let's take a look, shall we, at the front pages. Starting with the Metro, which leads with the tragic events which occurred in Solihull. The headline, victims of ice lake after 3 young boys died after falling into a freezing lake. The tragedy beyond words is also reported on the front page of tomorrow's Daily Express. The Sun, similarly, carries the frozen lake tragedy. And the Mirror too, rest in peace, boys, is their front page. The Times has the latest on the upcoming nurses' strike as thousands of patients will face cancellations after last-ditch talks to avert them collapsed. The Telegraph tells its readers that taxis may be used as ambulances in strikes under plans being considered by ministers. That's also making the front of the Eye. They say the NHS will block book taxis for patients in need of non-critical hospital care. Meanwhile, The Guardian draws attention to a government report blaming the NHS crisis on a Tory decade of neglect. Cold weather and road chaos on the front of the Daily Star as frozen Brits are being urged to cut their energy use in what the paper is calling Operation Brass Monkeys. The Daily Mail too calls out frozen Britain as heavy ice brings the country to a standstill. Meanwhile, the Financial Times covers the latest on London's stock exchange after Microsoft agrees to a $1.5 billion, I don't know if that's dollars or pounds actually, deal anyway, as part of a 10-year strategic partnership. Well, a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's head straight to our guests then, where we're joined by Harry Cole and John Stevens. And straight to the strikes we go, Harry. The Times and other newspapers picking up on the breakdown of those talks between the Royal College of Nursing and the Health Secretary. What happened and why is there no deal on the table for nurses?
There's slightly odd sort of fake talks this afternoon where the health secretary had said, there is going to be no budging. The offer's on the table. That's the offer from the pay bodies. But I'm happy to have a chat, come in for a cup of tea and we'll talk. And the nurses have said, well, if you actually talk properly, we'll be willing to suspend the strike on Thursday if negotiations are reopened. So they sort of went through the motions of talking today, but actually it turns out they both went into the same room, said their pieces that they were saying publicly all weekend, it seems, and then came out and the Royal College of Nurses went very heavy on Steve Barclay, calling him belligerent, and Barclay's people basically said, look, I said I wasn't going to renegotiate, but I'm happy to talk. So it was a sort of fake summit. But strikes are on tomorrow. The train service, the RMT, have said, our members back it only by 2/3. I know a third of members didn't vote for strike action. And interestingly, Unite, who also represent a very small number, but a number nonetheless of rail workers, have agreed to settle on that 9% over 2-year pay deal offered by Network Rail. So the first sign of cracks appearing in the unions, but the chaos is on regardless tomorrow and more importantly, I think, on Thursday.
Yes, and the mood music from the government in terms of the nurses' strike, at least, is to shift to contingency planning and ambulances, to be fair as well, from any settlement or any deal in this pay dispute. So a number of the newspapers picking up on what Health Minister Will Quince said about block booking taxis to take certain patients to hospital, John.
Yeah, so this is Will Quince was up in the Commons this afternoon and talking about this is the ambulance strike, which is due to take place next Wednesday, and talking about the different kind of precautions that they've put in place. And so talking about how if people aren't able to get an ambulance, this is for the kind of more minor cases. This isn't for things like heart attacks and strokes. This is if you kind of need patient transport, or if you've got an urgent problem, but it's not life-threatening, then you might get a taxi taking you to hospital. I mean, I struggle to see that there's going to be that many taxis available to do these jobs. We know that taxis are at their busiest at this time of year, people going to things like Christmas parties. But I think the whole government stance today has been quite bizarre. You had Oliver Dowden, who's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He chaired a COBRA meeting today. Afterwards, he came out and said that ministers would be straining every sinew to minimise disruption. And then you see the nurses saying, if the government's willing to have some sort of meaningful talks on pay, we will pause those strikes planned for hospitals this week. And the government says, no, we're not willing to have those talks. And clearly, if they were straining every sinew, they would be willing to go in there and find some sort of compromise. And I think the government has miscalculated on this one. At the start of the strikes, when it was just the rail unions, they seemed to be really enjoying this. They thought this is where they could whack Keir Starmer over the head. And as this is spread and spread and spread, I think that the thing that people think is that the country just isn't working, and the people they're blaming for that is the government rather than the unions or the Labour Party.
And if you read the Times, going back to that, the impact of all of this beginning to be clear, about 6,000 non-urgent operations are likely to be cancelled at the 45 hospitals in England and Wales affected by Thursday's strikes. Up to 64,000 outpatient appointments, including MRI scans and cancer checkups, could also be called off. And national NHS guidance, the paper tells us, says patients need 2 days' notice of cancellations. But because of the Royal Mail strikes, that means that hospitals can't send letters notifying patients. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you, Harry? Meanwhile, the Eye there, talking about the army once again, driving ambulances. Many people pointing out that some of those being called on to give up their Christmas are paid less than some of those going on strike. Should we require our military to step in this way?
Well, there's some process called MACA where the military assistance can be asked for by any government department. It is always controversial. Obviously, in the time, in the COVID, during the vaccine rollout, some of the supermarket shortages, I think they got involved with at one point, driving lorries during the pandemic. I think there's a frustration in sort of top brass that, the army is sort of seen always there as this contingency plan option that's just always going to turn up and not grumble and do their job. And I'm sure they will turn up and not grumble and do the job. But it is falling to sort of former generals like Sir Peter Wall, I think, was out tonight. Lord Dannatt was out yesterday saying, hang on, these guys have got a 4% pay rise. Let's see what really belligerence and unreasonableness looks like. The nurses are asking for 19% pay rise. Even Keir Starmer, the man that can barely bring himself to ever get off the fence, has said today that is unaffordable and urged them to be a little bit more reasonable in their discussions with the government. So it's not as quite as black and white as this idea that the government are just holding out. The government put an offer, on the table through the independent pay boards, and they're basically, they can't, if they give into one sector, they are going to have to give into all the sectors. So they're in a sort of tough position where they have to hold the line on all of it, take the heat, and really trying to do contingency planning now to try and alleviate the problems of the strikes, knowing that they're not going to be able to divert the strikes, because if they give into the RMT, then it's only going to bring other sectors, make them hold out for longer and make them hold out for more. But the nurses really are on an outlier with that 19% request that even the Labour Party are saying, come on, that's a bit mad.
Yes, just quickly, John, obviously in Scotland, nurses have accepted way less than that 19%, an average of 7.5%, with up to 11.2% for the bottom pay bands. That's been accepted, it seems. Strike called off there. Should there be some wriggle room? Should the government sniff that out?
I think a lot of the unions would be willing to take some sort of compromise. They've shown that in Scotland. I think if the government was willing to show some kind of ability to offer them a bit more, I'm sure a lot of people would say they'd much rather take that than go on strike. But I think it's quite interesting, particularly on ambulances, that we've had a lot more anger in the last couple of days about the possibility that there might be problems with ambulances on strike days than we've had over the last few months about the day-to-day state with ambulances. Anyone who's had to call an ambulance recently because they have had a stroke or a heart attack knows that the ambulances aren't being able to get there in their kind of target response times. And we've had nowhere near as much anger about that than we've had in the last few days about the strikes.
Well, let's move on, shall we? And it's hard to do not to do these two stories together, which is the travel disruption of frozen Britain, as the Daily Mail puts it, with the death of these 3 young boys in this lake in Solihull. Really brings home, does it not, the dangers of icy water, and that message certainly coming through from emergency services today, Harry. Yeah,
no, just a horrific story that every detail seems to get worse and worse. They were in hospital last night, these poor lads, and and the horrible news came through this morning. I think what's really jarring about this story for me as well is the fact that the police are determined to carry on searching because witnesses, and I understand footage, showed that there could have actually been up to 6 young people on that ice playing around in that area that afternoon. They stress that no one has come forward to say anyone else is missing, but they seem very determined to make sure they give that lake a proper, thorough, and obviously a very hard thing to do while the temperatures are so low. So a very, very grim story, and the sort of outpouring of grief in that community is it's very hard to watch.
Yes, and The Guardian picturing there some of the firefighters who paid their respects at the scene of the tragedy, suggesting that the 4 boys were reached by specialist water rescue trained firefighters. A police officer had tried to punch their way through the ice and had mild hypothermia as a consequence, but an absolute tragedy. As the Daily Mail, if we head back to that, John points out that, our transport grinds to a halt and striking rail unions will selfishly pile on the misery, if I quote that headline.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of misery, all sorts of different ways of travelling in the next few days. In that story, it also talks about motorways. Some people were stuck on the M25 for, I think, 8 hours last night. You just think that you might get stuck on some smaller roads, but you think if you're driving on the M25, you'd be fine. But also that absolutely heartbreaking image of that little boy there, 10-year-old Jack Johnson. A lot of the papers quoting his auntie posting on Facebook saying that he didn't know the other boys had fallen through the ice, but he went and ran to kind of go after them to try and look after them and save them, and obviously died in the process. So an absolutely awful story, as Harry says.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me, once again, the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole, and the political editor of the Daily Mirror, John Stevens. Welcome back to both of you. John, let's go straight to the Daily Telegraph. An imminent, we read here, a deal to speed up the return of Albanian migrants. Tell us more.
Yes, we've heard all about the Rwanda scheme where the government announced it, got loads of headlines. It's meant to be this great deterrent to stop people crossing the channel, but it wasn't a deterrent at all because they didn't end up sending anyone to Rwanda. And this time they've kind of decided on something which sounds a lot more practical, a lot more workable. Sounds like Rishi Sunak, possibly as soon as tomorrow or at least sometime this week, is going to announce fast-track return scheme. So people crossing the channel who are from Albania, the government will be able to send them back to Albania a lot more quickly. And we know that so far this year, I think it's about 44,000 people have crossed the channel, and about 12,000 of those, so around about a third, have been Albanian. And it's something that the Labour Party were calling for last week. Yvette Cooper was out there. I wonder if she may have had a whiff that this was something the government was about to do, so thought she would get ahead of it by going out there and saying that this is something that they should get on with. We know the Rwanda scheme, something the Labour Party was very opposed to, but this one, they say it's like things that the Labour Party did when Tony Blair was in power. They deem Albania as a safe country. They say that people crossing from there should be sent back, and then they get a move on and start sending them back. We know that some of the figures out around last week were suggesting that just 1% of the people who had come in the year to June from Albania, who put in an asylum application, had actually had it processed. And so this might be some way to kind of clear the backlog and get on with it.
Yes, and let's move on to the Times and Harry and Meghan, the latest instalment. You, one of those who keenly got up at 8 o'clock last Thursday morning to watch as many as you could. I think you managed 2 out of 3.
I can't believe you grasped me for that.
You watched 3 out of 3, everyone.
No such thing as a microphone that's off, is there? Yeah, look, I mean, the world is, I'm gripped. I just cannot believe. Everyone knew he was going to sort of spill the beans, but he really, really is going for it. I actually weirdly feel quite sorry for Harry. He's obviously, the trauma runs quite deep, and that relationship with his brother, I think now any hope of reconciliation between those two must surely be, far, far, far away. In a different age, a different time, royal families have, gone to war for less than some of the things that Harry and William have thrown at each other. So it is a horrible situation. I think it's beginning to backfire on the Sussexes. I think some of that impersonation of Meghan curtsying in front of the Queen, pretending she didn't know what she was doing, and generally mocking the royal family at a time when the King is still, the King of the country is still in mourning for the late monarch. Talk about tin-eared. So tune in for more tin-earedness next Thursday.